Welcome to the Walk Ride podcast.
Yes, and I'm Harry Gray.
And I'm Will York.
And we're both on the steering group for Walk Ride GM. So we thought we'd come together and create a podcast because there's just so much information around active travel, advocacy and delivery in Greater Manchester that, you know, people aren't accessing. So we thought that a podcast would be the best way to reach more people and inform more people. Yeah.
And get a bit of the conversations that you and I seem to have through WhatsApp voice notes all the time out there in the public realm.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of information that campaigners, advocates, like sometimes withhold from themselves, and there's an opportunity here to sort of express those sort of conversations and debates a bit more publicly so that we can all get involved a bit more. Yeah, so it's our first podcast, and obviously there's lots of stuff to sort of round up on this month. The first thing I'd sort of bring to the table is the change in government and what that's going to do for active travel going forwards.
So we have a Labour government now. They've said a lot about all forms of transport except walking and cycling. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I think it's quite curious actually, because we've seen, you know, the Transport Secretary, Louise Haigh, she has appointed a few ministers, you know, on a few different portfolios, but not a specific active travel minister. So we are really a bit, you know, concerned there that there isn't a focus on active travel. But on sort of, I think maybe potentially the reason for this, I would guess, is that active travel has become a bit of a cultural sort of issue over the last few years, and they're trying not to sort of spark any sort of fires around that sort of topic for now, and trying to sort of bring it through the sustainable travel sort of ticket, through sort of bus priority and other such sort of schemes. So I don't know. I'm not as downbeat maybe as some people are about the fact there's no minister.
I think I agree with you. I mean, we know that Labour have big devolution plans, and there may be a lot of scope over the next few years for people like Andy Burnham to set the agenda for how transport is going to work in Greater Manchester in a way that maybe they couldn't do under previous governments. I mean, I suppose one way of taking that is that that's quite good for places like Greater Manchester, where we do have a regional authority who really understand this stuff and want to improve active travel. But maybe it's less good news for, you know, people outside of our big mayoral city regions.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, devolution for us, what it means is that the decision making comes closer to us as campaigners. We have a good relationship with Andy Burnham, Sarah Story, and I think if that decision now is made at that GM level about active travel funding, then we can have a lot greater influence as campaigners than maybe if it was made at, you know, as a centralised government decision. So, you know, there's positives to that, but yes, you are right in the sense that if you're outside Greater Manchester, it maybe isn't looking as assured as the sort of decision making on active travel with that sort of limbo with the minister missing. Yeah.
And I guess if you're someone living in one of the many authorities who are really struggling for cash at the moment, then, you know, the lack of a confirmed dedicated active travel funding pot will mean that, you know, there's no money there to be spent on it.
Yeah, but I would be hesitant about trying to sort of make active travel its own dedicated funding. I think we really need to move towards a model where active travel is incorporated into road building as a whole and placemaking as a whole. So I just think trying to single out active travel on its own maybe is quite a traditional old-fashioned way of looking at the future of sort of the way that we build our streets and build our places, you know.
And that's, you know, that's what Greater Manchester say that we're going to be doing, or that we want to do, right, with the Streets for All strategy and the Streets for All design guide. We're supposedly moving towards a situation where we take a holistic view of a street. A street needs to be improved, or a street's planned to be improved, and it's improved for buses, it's improved for walking and cycling, and even drainage and street trees, and like bringing people back to the shops. We've got all of that written down now. The question is sort of, are we doing enough for our local authorities to push our local authorities to adopt that?
Exactly. And I think, there's that distance or that gap between what policymakers at a sort of GM level are advocating for, or even enacting into sort of policies like Streets for All, and also what the sort of officers and the politicians at a council level are, either willing to deliver, or even the knowledge base they have to deliver in terms of the skill set within the council, the resources, which is obviously a factor of the fact that central government has cut funding for local councils a lot in the last 10, 15 years since austerity. So there's a lot, it's a holistic approach really, and there's a lot of ducks need to line up to get delivery right for Greater Manchester, and that's something that Walker GM is really invested in, and we have our sort of campaign antennas out in all these sections of where active travel delivery makes a difference, and we're sort of getting our campaigners in all those positions and making sure that we have the most impact on that.
Let's round up on the news, the what's going on this month in active travel in Greater Manchester. So, Stockport, news from Stockport. Should we do the good news before the bad news?
Yeah, let's go for the good news.
Okay. Well, the good thing in Stockport is the shiny new bus interchange.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I've been a few times to visit it, and I'm pretty impressed actually. I think it delivers on that sort of grand vision of like what sustainable travel, what public transport needs to bring for people. And I think public transport has to be something that people can look at and be excited by if they're going to get out of the car. And the interchange is just so nice, and the public realm around it, the active travel routes within it and around it are just so really... I'd say it's beautiful. Like, it's a beautiful piece of infrastructure.
It
makes you want to live there. Like, makes you as a person excited and happy and like want to live in a place, which is just like it is in a way. It kind of speaks to that idea of like I know it's a bit, leveling up. Let's say it's like it speaks to the idea of like making places better for people to live in. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, you said the active travel routes in it and around it. Around it is possibly the problem. We have this thing of, I mean, we know, right? It's in the guidance that you should aim to deliver long, continuous routes. Like if you're doing a cycle route, you want to connect up places and not just do this one like standalone, beautiful, expensive piece of infrastructure that doesn't have stuff around it. Now, I get that. And you could level that criticism at the interchange, except the interchange is so good. And what it does that I think some people don't get until they've been there or used the area much is that if you're walking or cycling or using a wheelchair, it connects the train station to the bus station and the bus station down to the river. That's a huge level change. It's, I don't know, it must be well over 20 meters in height that you just can't traverse. Stockport is like old Stockport is full of steps, really, really steep staircases.
Yeah, it's a bit like Edinburgh, isn't it?
Yeah. And, imagine trying to plan a route between some of the shops and markets and stuff in Stockport if you're a wheelchair user. It's just not happening. I mean, you're going to have to get taxis or go a really long way round.
Or go down the A6.
or use the A6, which we all know is a pretty hostile place. So, although the interchange looks like it's just this standalone thing, it already is doing the job of connecting places and doing it really beautifully.
Yeah, I think the way I see it, it's a catalyst. It's a catalyst to that expanded network, and you have to sort out that very complicated and expensive grade change in the centre of Stockport to connect to the key pieces of infrastructure, which is, like you said, is the train station, the bus station, the town centre, and also down to the river. So yeah, it does tick all those boxes. And now, we don't want that to be wasted, do we? We don't want that work to be wasted without connectivity across to the sort of suburban side parts of Stockport, or even the sort of outside of the town centre.
Because, logically, where do you go from here? Like, there are schemes. I think Stockport Council understand that this is a linchpin, or should be a linchpin for their network, because they've got work going on in Town Centre West on the other side of the viaduct. They've got a plan for Edgeley.
Yeah.
They've
Stockport 8.
The Stockport 8 development is part of Town Centre West. And they've been doing some stuff in the town centre, over towards the market hall from the train station. And then there are questions about the quality of all of those schemes. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that none of them match the quality of the interchange.
Yeah, and I think, that is a really good sort of position to be in the sense that we can point at that interchange and say, look, that's the standard of scheme we want to see across Stockport on carriageway too, not just, off the road. We want the same standard of cycle and walk-in scheme down the carriageway, i.e. the A6.
And Stockport councillors and officers must be aware of this already, right? They must already be hearing from residents how much they love the interchange, how good it is. How I've heard very, very few bad words about it.
No, completely, and its success really should help other schemes get delivered. And we, as a campaign group, are one of the biggest things about what we do at Walk Garage M is we have to point out successes, and we have to make sure that councillors and other elected members know that this is something that Walk Garage M is really positive about, so that change can happen further down the line.
So should we talk about the bit that we're less positive about?
Yeah.
Which is the A6 running right past the interchange. For people who don't know Stockport, is Wellington Road, the A6. So the thing about the A6 is, for so much of its length in Greater Manchester, it's the only route that goes in anything like a straight direct line. And the thing about straight direct lines routes is, if you want new people, not talking about you and me, right? So me and Harry already cycle most of our journeys, and we know all the little alleyways and ins and outs and sort of quiet cul-de-sacs or LTNs or whatever. But someone who hasn't been on their bike since they were a teenager, they want, they know the A6. They know that is the way into Manchester, or the way to Levenshulme, the city centre from Stockport.
It's just an A to B, isn't it? Like, most people aren't researching how they get about. Most people just see, here's a road, I'll go down this road. And a lot of the time it's cycling or walking on the pavement, You see a lot of people cycling on the pavement on the A6.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's the route that makes sense to them, and they don't feel comfortable on the carriageway. And understandably, because it's horrible. Yeah.
And so, the A6, there are plans for a sort of parallel route, for a sort of quiet way route for the A6, which have just sort of over this year been announced by the council. And at Walk Garage M, we're pretty opposed to that for a few reasons. The reasons we just mentioned there about directness, but also because, we've seen in other parts of even Greater Manchester that main arterial roads can have active travel and bus priority provisions. Look at Oxford Road. That's one of the biggest success stories of Greater Manchester.
Oh, yeah.
And, the funding model for the scheme says that, it is in the funding model that it has to deliver for buses and pedestrians and cyclists. And this current tangential scheme does not do that. So, we're pushing hard for the A6 to be to have active travel provisions, and it's one of our sort of main campaigns in Stockport.
Yeah, I mean, this will all sort of come to a head pretty soon, I think, because the scheme is up for approval at area committee soon. I think the crux of the walk ride position is that there is room. It's the road at its narrowest point, the part of the road Stockport are talking about, is 20 metres wide.
Yeah. 20 metres, other authorities would bite your hand off to have 20 metres of space. Let's be real. Have you ever tried to travel through Withington? They managed to get a bus priority and a cycle priority scheme through Withington, and it is, a matter of meters wide. So it is possible, it is deliverable. It's about political will, and it's also about the sort of will within the council, the officers, to deliver a scheme.
And you touched on the fact that this comes from the City Region Sustainable Transport Settlement. So this is money that comes from national government for Andy Burnham to allocate effectively.
Yeah, I think it came from Boris Johnson, if I'm right.
Did it? So the funding criteria call for ambitious priority cycling provision. I think what we see in the proposed parallel route for cyclists is not ambitious.
No, and I don't understand really. It's the government are letting the government are telling councils to be more ambitious.
And what we get is, in the case of this particular scheme in Stockport, is that cyclists are sent down existing shared use pavements where pedestrians and cyclists come into conflict with each other. Granted, they are proposing some work to separate and improve those routes, but then up through an industrial estate with turning lorries, past an abattoir which stinks, up a unlit tree-lined alleyway, which again they're talking about adding lighting to, but lighting or not, I feel unsafe there at night. It's so unused. It's so devoid of surveillance.
Yeah, and you can get into the details of the parallel route, but just to take it back, we're talking about multi-million-pound settlement to transform an arterial road. It's not a serious proposal. And that's fundamentally the problem. It's not a serious proposal by a serious council. If they think that they can push cyclists onto a side road and keep the road just for cars and add some small improvements to bus provisions, it's just not serious. And, in Manchester, Greater Manchester now, we are in a position now where we can actually demand better because we've seen better. And stuff like this just doesn't pass through us as campaigners anymore. So we have a lot more authority to push back, because I know there's a lot of people in Stockport who want this scheme to deliver for walking and cycling.
And I think some of the, I think Stockport councillors are probably starting to be aware that, Manchester are working on their own CRSTS A6 scheme, which will come from Manchester right up to the Stockport border, and there will be a very visible border where Manchester's scheme ends and Stockport's scheme begins. Now, we don't know any details of the Manchester scheme, but I think it's safe to say that based on what we've heard so far, there'll be quite an embarrassing visible comparison when, at that border, at that divide between an authority who are really trying to do their best to balance different modes on the road and an authority who's got the widest, easiest stretch of the A6 to deal with and has decided to preserve nearly all of it for motor traffic.
Exactly. You look at some of the constraints you have through Levenshulme, through Longsight, that's going to be the hard bit of the A6.
Oh, yeah.
Not the bit in Stockport. That's the easy bit. But that's a good segue into Manchester, because I've got a few things to talk about with Manchester. I think Manchester's progressing quite well with active travel. But yeah, since Manchester released its active travel strategy, which I think is pretty good actually, a lot of stuff on school streets and an actual active travel network, we've seen a few schemes come forward, which are sort of really joining up all the dots in Manchester.
We are talking now, just to be clear, about Manchester City, not Greater Manchester.
Yeah, the distinction there between the sort of 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester and Manchester City Council as its own sort of sliver of the city. So yeah, the main sort of one coming forward at the moment is the works to finish the sort of Deansgate cycle lane, and that'll connect the Deansgate interchange sort of cycle infrastructure, which goes all the way to Chorlton, and it will connect that to the top of Deansgate and actually out towards Oxford Road train station and through the sort of north of Manchester, which is being called the city centre triangle. And this is quite a sort of complicated scheme because it is actually the first scheme that is in the city centre for active travel, for cycling provisions in terms of junctions. So there's been some changes on the original designs, and they've actually removed some of the Cyclops junctions, and they've put some bi-directional sort of London, I guess like London, you call them like London style sort of junctions in, and that's
what happens at one of these London style junctions, because I'm not as clued up on you as this on the city centre stuff.
So I think the London, I don't know the technical sort of terms for this, but it is a bi-directional sort of cycle lane on one side of the road, and it doesn't have that tangential link that the Cyclops has, so you don't have cycle lanes joining into that bi-directional lane. It is just a sort of north-south.
Oh, I see. And you either turn off it or turn onto it from roads which intersect Deansgate.
Yeah, but you'll be turning onto it from unprotected sort of painted cycle lanes, which I think is a bit of a concern just because the active travel strategy, the network they have, some of these tangential roads are actually part of the active travel strategy network. So it is a bit of a challenge because we do want every route to be to be possible with this strategy. But I think it is in a way a compromise because of the high pedestrian footfall you see on Deansgate, and they were worried that there'd be too many people stood on the sort of traffic island waiting to cross the road that a Cyclops creates. So I can sort of see that, and it's an incremental change. You know, I think a lot of people think that when you deliver a scheme, it is the solution, and in a lot of occasions, it's not the solution. It is an incremental change based on, you know, hundreds of stakeholders. You know, you've got businesses, you've got councillors, you've got advocates like us, you've got, you know, the leaders, you've got the officers. There's so many people have an input on a scheme, and it pulls in so many directions. And in the end, you do sometimes just get a fudge, and people get angry at that. But that's just the reality.
It's one of those challenging things to see as a campaigner, isn't it? Like we see things go in that aren't perfect. I mean, take Oxford Road, for example. You know, Oxford Road, Wilmslow Road was the flagship 2017 scheme, like the start of the active travel B network. And, you know, it's fantastic. It's one of those where you're like, anyone who tells you that it's worse having it than not having it is wrong.
Exactly. And at the time, you know, as Oxford Road is being delivered, you know, there's no treatment on the junctions. The cycle lanes are too narrow. Curry Mile is still dangerous. There's too much parking on Curry Mile. You know, all these things were said, yet year on year, we see the share of people using that route increase to record-breaking levels. So on that metric...
Using it by cycle.
Yes, and on that metric, it's a success. You know, regardless of what, you know, people say about the technical aspect of it. So I think we've got to look at things... We've got to look at outcomes. We've got to look at outcomes, and the outcome is that that Oxford Road corridor has driven the whole strategy for Manchester for active travel. Because without it, there is no Chorlton Cycleway, there is no city centre triangle. There just isn't anything after that, because that is the catalyst, that's the start. And that's kind of what I was saying about the interchange in Stockport. Like, there has to be something that we can point to and say this is the start of something.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to let perfect be the enemy of good. Is
not
the
at all.
Saying.
No, not at all. We have.
And the interchange is perfect, can I just say? So that's fine.
No, I agree. We can't let perfect be the enemy of good in active travel.
So bringing it back to Deansgate then, what do we like about this scheme?
I think really it is ticking the box of delivering a north to south route through the centre of Manchester that connects a lot of the southern suburbs into the centre rather than dropping you off on the outskirts of the centre. So it ticks that box. It's also, for me, it's also delivering on this idea that we're incrementally reducing the amount of cars being driven around the city centre. It's changing Deansgate to a one-way, so it's one-way southbound only. And there's also some talk from the councillors about filtering some of the roads around it, which hasn't been included this time. So there is that sort of idea that gradually, for scheme by scheme, bus gate by bus gate, we are reducing the amount of motor vehicles driven in the city centre. But the problem I have is that incrementally can only work up to a point. And like water, traffic just flows where there's gaps, and we need to find or model a solution for the city centre so that we can understand fundamentally where the traffic's coming from, how it's driving through the city centre, so that we can model a way to stop through traffic in the city centre so that there's less traffic in the city centre, because 50,000 people have moved to Manchester city centre in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years. So, all those people, have to find a way of getting about. And we, as advocates, want them to walk, cycle, or get the bus or tram. But if it's so easy to drive, then they're just going to drive, and it's just going to clog the streets with more cars. So we have to model the traffic and find out a plan for the city centre. And I saw this week that Birmingham have just put forward their proposal for a circulation plan in the centre of Birmingham. So, why can't we do the same in Manchester? It's something that can be done.
So a circulation plan is a filtering and sort of conversion of roads to one way, whatever interventions you make, so that if you have a ring road that is for cars, you can use that ring road to get in and out to do deliveries or work to whatever property anywhere in the city centre, but you can't drive through the city centre to get from one side to the other, and therefore you're sort of removing traffic that doesn't need to be there, clogging up the place where people are living and trying to shop and eat.
Yeah, and cities across the world have sort of adopted this. If you look at in the Netherlands, they've adopted it naturally. They haven't actually engineered it into as a sort of flagship scheme. They've just sort of done it as part of their sort of movement plan. But places like Ghent, famously they brought their circulation plan in, I think six or so years ago. And I've visited a few times before and after the circulation plan, and it has really transformed the amount of traffic in the centre and increased the amount of people walking and cycling. So it's something that we need to look at in Manchester, something that Walk Ride GM's definitely campaigning on and pushing forward. And I've spoken to a few people, councillors, who are sort of starting to come around to it because they want to understand, instead of a whack-a-mole approach to traffic on, their residents are telling them, you've made that road on Deansgate one way. Well, I need, this road next to it. Or the residents in my ward are saying there's too many cars there now. We need to have a holistic approach to traffic in the city centre. And
that was one of the founding moments for Mums for Lungs, and some of the clean air campaign, right, was city centre schools and crazy levels, dangerous levels of pollution in the air. It's probably a topic for a future podcast.
Yeah. We'll move on to the next borough. So moving on to Trafford. I'm a bit more familiar with Trafford than Will, just because I actually work in Trafford. And we've got some really good campaigners in Trafford. It's really active space for Walk Ride GM, especially on our Discord, actually, which is a platform we use to campaign. Trafford had a change in leadership a few years ago, and the new leader, Tom Ross, he has come in, and it seems like he's bringing a new sort of strategy with active travel. They've hired a few new officers who are active travel officers, especially around school streets, and they seem to have a bit more of a sort of coherent strategy around what they want to deliver in the borough. A few of the sort of schemes that have been in the pipeline have come to fruition. There's a few cyclopses on Talbot Road. At the end of Talbot Road, where it meets the A56, there's a new junction design there, which will link up with the new the temporary ones that are going to go down the A6 to Stretford, which replace the cones, which were famously installed.
Not the A6, the A56.
A56, yeah.
56.
Yeah. Which replaced the cones on the A56, the infamous cones, which obviously in the media had a lot of attention. So there is a lot going on in Trafford, especially around school streets. They have a school street officer, and she's really pushing on with the delivery of the school streets. They're using volunteers, I think, and it seems like there's a lot of backing from the council politically to get these school streets rolled out. And we've seen similar things happen in Manchester, and there is a sort of Andy Burnham has put out that sort of 100 school streets delivery plan by the end of this term. So Trafford is pushing ahead, and we're pretty happy with Trafford. And we're sort of now thinking about what's the plan going forward after these sort of schemes have come to fruition? Like, are we going to have a network plan? Are we going to have a plan for the sort of city side of Trafford? Are we going to have an entire network plan?
It sounds like they can see where the gaps need joining up, because White City Roundabout is on the cards for the future as well.
They've tendered out a sort of feasibility study for White City Roundabout. They've also got Seymour Grove in the pipeline. I guess now for Trafford, that from what we've heard, it's all about where's the next round of funding coming from to deliver the next set of schemes. And that's the same across Greater Manchester. With devolution, what we talked about at the start of the podcast, we need Andy Burnham to, commit to funding active travel through his devolution deal.
That's one of the most important things to say sort of in this space, is that not every borough, but nearly every borough in Greater Manchester has devoted significant resource that's been enabled by national funding to upskilling, to getting people in, to starting to develop these plans, these strategies for how they can enable people to walk and cycle in their boroughs.
Exactly. Without any money forward, that has been done without the promise of any future funding.
Well, but it was done on the expectation, I think, that the funding would continue, and then Rishi Sunak snatched it all away.
Exactly, and that just shows the perils of government. You could put in a plan for delivery, and in the space of a few months, it's turned on its head. So that's why we sympathise with local government.
Absolutely. But I think the demand has to be, don't waste that work. All of that effort, all of those teams, all those pipelines that have been set up, were put at risk. What's it been, a year ago now? Not even a year ago. It's actually been really rapid, this turnaround. But it's all still there. It's all ready to go. We have an entire country, certainly a city region, that is ready to deliver really, really positive schemes for its residents.
Yeah, I'd say, for the thing I've noticed really is that swap around. We used to have a government that was willing to fund active travel and councils that were unwilling to deliver. And in the last year, it switched. We've now got a government, well, up until literally the other day, we had a government unwilling to fund active travel, and then councils which had actually, the politics had changed and they were starting to, come forward with that sort of vision.
I think we're getting sidetracked a bit, but public perception has also finally started to shift, I feel. Like obviously, there is a minority of really angry people on the internet who hate it when they see a cyclist anywhere on the road or see anyone, presumably they get equally angry when they see pedestrians walking, crossing a side road. I don't know. But
we don't jaywalk here, do we? Come
on. But the feeling I get from all the regular people I meet around Greater Manchester is that people are seeing the successful new stuff going, like the Chiltern Cycleway, and thinking, yeah, great, that's there. It's been built for me. I'm going to use it. I'm going to dust off that old bike and I'm going to commute to work, because now I can, and I don't get stuck in traffic in my car, and I don't get knocked off and killed by someone because I've got a safe space.
Yeah. And I think not just the infrastructure that's been built, it is the sort of change in perception of active travel. It's gone from something maybe, it's gone from what would be called cycle campaigning in the past, which I think was quite exclusionary. It tended to be the same kind of people who were with the same sort of mindset about cycling, and now it's broadened out. Active travel, it encompasses walking, cycling, wheeling, scooting. That involves families, that involves kids, that involves, people who want to get on the bike, it involves people who want a wheelchair down the road. And I think that means that we represent more people. That means we have a broader consensus, and it means we get listened to. And that's really important for campaigning on active travel, which is a bit of a tangent to what we were talking about in Trafford, but I think it all relates, because the reason we're doing so well in a lot of places is because we're being listened to, and maybe in the past, campaigners, like let's say cycling campaigners, might not have been listened to as much because of the way that the debate's been framed.
And now we're working hard to be more representative. We're not just cycling campaigners. Like we're active travel campaigners. Like you and I have started speaking more and more to various disability groups across GM, which has been brilliant, hasn't it? Isn't it just great to like go out and talk to people and like begin to hear about their lived experience?
Yeah, because, you can only really understand every user if you go out and meet them and talk to them and experience what they've experienced. So, going to school streets, going to junctions with the RNIB and looking at junctions from a completely different perspective. It's really important as campaigners that we put ourselves in as many people's shoes as possible so that we can advocate for as many people, not talk for people. It's important that people, especially disabled people, can talk for themselves and speak for themselves, but we need to have the resources to advocate for them so that we're upskilled enough that we know, what the problems they face so that we can advocate for them. And I was going to bring it back to that, to Trafford, because Trafford Council have delivered the best accessible Cyclops junction so far in Greater Manchester. There's a video on our Walk Ride GM Twitter and on our LinkedIn, which you can watch, which demonstrates why this junction's so good.
Well, I'm actually going to go and get my bike from Ancoats after this and cycle home along Talbot Road via Trafford and Chorlton and see what all the fuss is about after watching your video.
Nice.
It's something that I think we'd like everyone who's in any way involved in Walk Ride to do, is to talk to people, understand the challenges that people with different experiences to you face, and advocate for that. Because, at the end of the day, we're all on the same side in this. We all want streets that are a good, pleasant, accessible, safe place to be. And, any arguments, any organisations that try to pit cyclists versus blind people, or like you can have cycle lanes or buses, but you can't have both. This is just nonsense. Like we're all striving for better solutions as campaigners, as road users. Rochdale, then. Rochdale's got one of the most exciting new schemes for active travel in Greater Manchester. There's a phase 1 in Castleton, which Harry and I went to visit last week. And phase 2 has just been approved by the council and is going ahead as long as it also gets sort of TFGM and sign off.
Yeah, it's been signed off by the council, so I think that's most of the hurdles jumped to get that delivered. And I think the second phase will start in the next year, and that will connect Castleton all the way to Rochdale. A lot of communities on that route, but there's also that the road in the phase 2 is just so hostile. It's like a huge dual carriageway. It's got loads of underpasses, and we went on a visit to see the phase 1 and also to see where phase 2 is going to go. Yeah,
we got off the train at Rochdale Station, and then we went to the town hall. Harry got us lost, but that's fine. We went to the town hall, which is obviously great. The new town hall square, the new town hall refurb, a lot of money poured into the town centre.
You got to remember that town hall square used to be a car park as well, so that's more public realm sort of gained from sort of car parking, which is like really good to see.
And then we went from there along Manchester Road, or not on Manchester Road because it is terrifying. I remember you were just turning around to me at every point and saying, how does this still exist in Greater Manchester? Because even, you live in Salford, right? Mm-hmm. And even the most hostile, horrible big road in Salford is nothing like those monstrosities up in Rochdale.
Yeah, I think there are some horrible roads in Salford like that, but they do seem to have like parallel roads, like parallel quiet roads. Whereas this one, to me, it was just so hostile. It was, and I couldn't. It's a bit of a culture shock actually, because obviously when you live in a city centre, you're kind of used to quite good infrastructure. Not perfect infrastructure, but better infrastructure. So when you go to sort of somewhere like that and you see how wide the road is, how hostile it is. For anyone walking or cycling there, it would be almost like impossible, really.
Someone could live like, a few hundred meters away from you on the other side of that road, and it would take you, like, you'd probably drive to see them to avoid having to cross that road.
Like you would in LA. You just drive across the road to go see your friend.
I mean, at one point you took a toucan crossing, and I took the underpass. And honestly, I've not seen anything like that underpass since I was a kid in Nottingham, because I think they've all been like infilled and closed because of all the stabbings. It's that much like, 70s.
And that just shows how this sort of this sort of architecture of this road creates such like negative public spaces, like dangerous public spaces. And it's important that we de-engineer these spaces and make them more, hospitable for people to sort of live in, rather than just travel through. And that's what the scheme delivers. We went to the first phase, and as soon as we left this, horrible dual carriageway, got to Castleton, I couldn't believe how much the sort of phase one had improved the area. There was kids on scooters, there was kids on skateboards, there was kids on bikes, because it was just as school was finishing. And I just thought, wow, like, we constantly say kids need to be active, kids need to get off the phones, kids need to, and you know what? Give them the infrastructure, and they will get off their phones, and they will go scoot down the road and cycle down the road. And it's sort of funny, isn't it, how kids I think this, which is kids, they're not tainted by, society. They know, I always think there's that innocence of youth, and they know best, and they just want to go on their scooters and their skateboards and travel down the road, and they're sort of showing, I thought they were kind of showing the adults how it's done.
Yeah. I mean, this is, it's a local high street, right? There's fish and chip shops, there's the grocery store, there's like a bakery, Alice was telling us, from Rochdale. And, we don't want to like pretend there's no issues for business, because we know that like part of this is the quick stop off on street parking right in front of your bakery that gets moved to a off street parking bay a bit down the road. And like, some residents used to park on the road right in front of their houses, and now they've got parking bays provided as part of the scheme, like down the next side road, 2 minutes walk away from their house. But the improvement, the change, like this is what the high street always was, right? Before every single family owned a car or two cars. I mean, not every family owns a car. That's not even true to say, is it? We've
created environments that make it seem like everyone drives. That's what I think. So you look at the high street in Rochdale, and if you walk down that high street, you think, well, everyone must drive here. But in reality, we saw plenty of people walking to the shops and cycling to the shops there, especially on the new infrastructure. And it's important that like everyone in society is represented on these schemes, especially the people who don't have as much of a voice. And I think it is fair in a place where we're trying to change behaviour. It is fair that we give people who drive a space to park like nearby. But I still think that it is not, we cannot say that everyone should be able to park outside the business that they're going in to shop. If you went to a mall, you wouldn't drive into the mall and park outside the shop inside the mall. Mm-hmm. You'd park in the car park and walk to the mall. So it isn't any different to suggest that someone on a high street would park in a car park nearby and walk to the high street. I think it's quite a reasonable ask.
And part of this is, not to downplay, changes that individual businesses face in the short term, but this is about regenerating and bringing high streets back to life. High streets have been on the decline for a long, long time. And part of that is that they've turned into environments where no one wants to spend time. Like if you've got your average like local high street, no bike lanes, not wide pavements, like no street trees, because everything went to provide more on-street parking and more throughput of cars. No one's dwelling there. No one's thinking, I'll just wander around and see what's in the shops and maybe pop in and like sit in a cafe. cafes aren't putting out outside tables because the air is like thick with petrol fumes.
Yeah, and what we've learned about high streets recently is that high streets are becoming places where people want to have an experience-based sort of activity rather than a purchase, like a sort of a retail activity. So it is important that like we adapt the way we think about high streets to make them more successful going forward. And obviously active travel is a part of that, but placemaking is also one of, is the bigger picture here, and we've got to make places nicer. And that's, again, ties back to what we said about Stockport. It's like Stockport's success is being driven by good placemaking, fundamentally at its core. You look at the underbanks, the pedestrianisation there, it's being driven by good placemaking. And, we have to look at places like Castleton and think, how can we invigorate the high street there? It's through good placemaking. And one of the schemes they're bringing forward for that is that they're actually got funds to restore some of the shop fronts and make them, more uniform and nicer. So, it isn't just about active travel. There's a bigger approach here, and Rochdale is actually delivering that. So that's it for this week's Roundup on the Walk Ride GM podcast. Let us know if there's anything you want us to talk about, any topics that we've missed, anything that you sort of want to learn about active travel that you don't really understand, if you want us to discuss it, and we might include it in the next month's show. And if you live in Bolton, Bury, Wigan, Tameside, Oldham, or Salford, Harry lives in Salford. Sorry there wasn't any news this time. Get in touch, get involved, get on the Discord. Yeah, actually, that's such a good point. Like, we have a Discord, which is about 300 of us are in there. And there's loads of different channels for different topics, different regional topics. So for Salford, for Rochdale, all these places, there's people discussing, debating, throwing ideas out there. And it's really landing. It's making our roles at Walk Ride GM so much easier. It's making the way that we campaign so much more dynamic. And it's having a massive impact. Like, people are coming together and almost like crowdsourcing information and working together to deliver like campaign materials and campaign tools. So it's such a cool space. And yeah, I urge you to go on our website. If you go on the Get Involved tab on our website, you can join our Discord from there. Yeah, you can try it out on a web browser. You can download the app and access it from your phone. I know it's another thing to sign up to, another app to download, but honestly, like, this is the space where so many of these conversations are happening now. Yeah, and even if you don't want to like jump in and get like talking, you can just be a lurker. There's quite a few lurkers in there who just love looking at all the information. So you don't even have to, people come up to me and say, I'm in the Discord, but I don't contribute. I just like looking at stuff. So it's a space for anyone. So yeah, we'll see you again next time, and thanks for joining us on this inaugural episode of the Walk Ride GM podcast. See ya.